Cultural legacies are powerful forces. They have deep roots and long lives. They persist, generation after generation, virtually intact, even as the economic and social and demographic conditions that spawned them have vanished, and they play such a role in directing attitudes and behavior that we cannot make sense of our world without them. So far in Outliers we've seen that success arises out of the steady accumulation of advantages, when and where you are born, what your parents did for a living, and what the circumstances of your upbringing were all make a significant difference in how well you do in the world. The question for the second part of Outliers is whether the traditions and attitudes we inherit from our forebears can play the same role. Can we learn something about why people succeed and how to make people better at what they do by taking cultural legacies seriously? I think we can. Chapter 7. The Ethnic Theory of Plane Crashes. Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot. 1. On the morning of August 5, 1997, the captain of Korean Air Flight 801 woke at 6. His family would later tell investigators that he went to the gym for an hour, then came home and studied the flight plan for that evening's journey to Guam. He napped and ate lunch. At 3 in the afternoon, he left for Seoul, departing early enough, his wife said, to continue his preparations at Kimpo International Airport. He had been a pilot with Korean Air for almost 4 years after coming over from the Korean Air Force. He had 8,900 hours of flight time, including 3,200 hours of experience in jumbo jets. A few months earlier, he had been given a flight safety award by his airline for successfully handling a jumbo jet engine failure at low altitude. He was 42 years old and in excellent health, with the exception of a bout of bronchitis that had been diagnosed 10 days before. At 7 p.m., the captain, his first officer, and the flight engineer met and collected the trip's paperwork. They would be flying a Boeing 747, the model known in the aviation world as the Classic. The aircraft was in perfect working order. It had once been the Korean presidential plane. Flight 801 departed the gate at 10:30 in the evening and was airborne 20 minutes later. Takeoff was without incident. Just before 1:30 in the morning, the plane broke out of the clouds, and the flight crew glimpsed lights off in the distance. "Is it Guam?" the flight engineer asked. Then, after a pause, he said, "It's Guam, Guam." The captain chuckled. "Good." The first officer reported to air traffic control that the airplane was clear of Charlie Bravo and requested radar vectors for runway 6 left. The plane began its descent toward Guam Airport. They would make a visual approach, the captain said. He had flown into Guam Airport from Kimpo 8 times previously, most recently a month ago, and he knew the airport and the surrounding terrain well. The landing gear went down. The flaps were extended 10 degrees. At 1:41 and 48 seconds, the captain said, "Wiper on," and the flight engineer turned them on. It was raining. The first officer then said, "Not in sight?" He was looking for the runway. He couldn't see it. 1 second later, the ground proximity warning system called out in its electronic voice, 500, the plane was 500 feet off the ground. But how could that be if they couldn't see the runway? 2 seconds passed. The flight engineer said, in an astonished tone of voice. At 1:42 and 19 seconds, the first officer said, "Let's make a missed approach," meaning, let's pull up and make a large circle and try the landing again. 1 second later, the flight engineer said, "Not in sight." The first officer added, "Not in sight, missed approach." At 1:42 and 22 seconds, the flight engineer said again, "Go around." At 1:42 and 23 seconds, the captain repeated, "Go around," but he was slow to pull the plane out of its descent. At 1:42 and 26 seconds, the plane hit the side of Nimitz Hill, a densely vegetated mountain 3 miles southwest of the airport, $60 million and 212,000 kilograms of steel slamming into rocky ground at 100 miles per hour. The plane skidded for 2,000 feet, severing an oil pipeline and snapping pine trees, before falling into a ravine and bursting into flames. By the time rescue workers reached the crash site, 228 of the 254 people on board were dead. 2. 20 years before the crash of KAL 801, a Korean Air Boeing 707 wandered into Russian airspace and was shot down by a Soviet military jet over the Barents Sea. It was an accident, meaning the kind of rare and catastrophic event that, but for the grace of God, could happen to any airline. It was investigated and analyzed. Lessons were learned. Reports were filed. Then, 2 years later, a Korean Air Boeing 747 crashed in Seoul. 2 accidents in 2 years is not a good sign. 3 years after that, the airline lost another 747 near Sakhalin Island, in Russia, followed by a Boeing 707 that went down over the Andaman Sea in 1987, 2 more crashes in 1989 in Tripoli and Seoul, and then another in 1994 in Jeju, South Korea. To put that record in perspective, the loss rate for an airline like the American carrier United Airlines in the period 1988 to 1998 was 27 per million departures, which means that they lost a plane in an accident about once in every 4 million flights. The loss rate for Korean Air, in the same period, was 4.79 per million departures, more than 17 times higher. Korean Air's planes were crashing so often that when the National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. agency responsible for investigating plane crashes within American jurisdiction, did its report on the Guam crash, it was forced to include an addendum listing all the new Korean Air accidents that had happened just since its investigation began. The Korean Air 747 that crash-landed at Kimpo in Seoul, almost a year to the day after Guam, the jetliner that overran a runway at Korea's Ulsan Airport 8 weeks after that. The Korean Air McDonnell Douglas 83 that rammed into an embankment at Pohang Airport the following March, and then, a month after that, the Korean Air passenger jet that crashed in a residential area of Shanghai. Had the NTSB waited just a few more months, it could have added another, the Korean Air cargo plane that crashed just after takeoff from London Stansted Airport, despite the fact that a warning bell went off in the cockpit no fewer than 14 times. In April 1999, Delta Air Lines and Air France suspended their flying partnership with Korean Air. In short order, the U.S. Army, which maintains thousands of troops in South Korea, forbade its personnel from flying with the airline. South Korea's safety rating was downgraded by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, and Canadian officials informed Korean Air's management that they were considering revoking the company's overflight and landing privileges in Canadian airspace. In the midst of the controversy, an outside audit of Korean Air's operations was leaked to the public. The 40-page report was quickly denounced by Korean Air officials as sensationalized and unrepresentative, but by that point, it was too late to save the company's reputation. The audit detailed instances of flight crews smoking cigarettes on the tarmac during refueling and in the freight area, and when the plane was in the air. Crew read newspapers throughout the flight, the audit stated, often with newspapers held up in such a way that if a warning light came on, it would not be noticed. The report detailed bad morale, numerous procedural violations, and the alarming conclusion that training standards for the 747 Classic were so poor that there is some concern as to whether first officers on the Classic fleet could land the aircraft if the captain became totally incapacitated. By the time of the Shanghai crash, the Korean president, Kim Dae-jung, felt compelled to speak up. The issue of Korean Air is not a matter of an individual company but a matter of the whole country, he said. Our country's credibility is at stake. Kim then switched the presidential plane from Korean Air to its newer rival, Asiana, but then a small miracle happened. Korean Air turned itself around. Today, the airline is a member in good standing of the prestigious SkyTeam Alliance. Its safety record since 1999 is spotless. In 2006, Korean Air was given the Phoenix Award by Air Transport World in recognition of its transformation. Aviation experts will tell you that Korean Air is now as safe as any airline in the world. In this chapter, we're going to conduct a crash investigation, listen to the black box cockpit recorder, examine the flight records, look at the weather and the terrain and the airport conditions, and compare the Guam crash with other very similar plane crashes. all in an attempt to understand precisely how the company transformed itself from the worst kind of outlier into one of the world's best airlines. It is a complex and sometimes strange story. But it turns on a very simple fact, the same fact that runs through the tangled history of Harlan and the Michigan students. Korean Air did not succeed, it did not right itself. Until it acknowledged the importance of its cultural legacy. 3. Plane crashes rarely happen in real life the same way they happen in the movies. Some engine part does not explode in a fiery bang. The rudder doesn't suddenly snap under the force of takeoff. The captain doesn't gasp, "Dear God," as he's thrown back against his seat. The typical commercial jetliner, at this point in its stage of development, is about as dependable as a toaster. Plane crashes are much more likely to be the result of an accumulation of minor difficulties and seemingly trivial malfunctions. In a typical crash, for example, the weather is poor, not terrible, necessarily, but bad enough that the pilot feels a little bit more stressed than usual. In an overwhelming number of crashes, the plane is behind schedule, so the pilots are hurrying. In 52% of crashes, the pilot at the time of the accident has been awake for 12 hours or more, meaning that he is tired and not thinking sharply. And 44% of the time, the two pilots have never flown together before, so they're not comfortable with each other. Then the errors start, and it's not just one error. The typical accident involves 7 consecutive human errors. One of the pilots does something wrong that by itself is not a problem. Then one of them makes another error on top of that, which combined with the first error still does not amount to catastrophe. But then they make a third error on top of that, and then another and another and another and another, and it is the combination of all those errors that leads to disaster. These 7 errors, furthermore, are rarely problems of knowledge or flying skill. It's not that the pilot has to negotiate some critical technical maneuver and fails. The kinds of errors that cause plane crashes are invariably errors of teamwork and communication. One pilot knows something important and somehow doesn't tell the other pilot. One pilot does something wrong, and the other pilot doesn't catch the error. A tricky situation needs to be resolved through a complex series of steps, and somehow the pilots fail to coordinate and miss one of them. The whole flight deck design is intended to be operated by 2 people, and that operation works best when you have one person checking the other, or both people willing to participate, says Earl Weiner, who was for many years chief engineer for safety at Boeing. Airplanes are very unforgiving if you don't do things right. And for a long time it's been clear that if you have 2 people operating the airplane cooperatively, you will have a safer operation than if you have a single pilot flying the plane and another person who is simply there to take over if the pilot is incapacitated. Consider, for example, the famous crash of the Colombian airliner Avianca Flight 052 in January of 1990. The Avianca accident so perfectly illustrates the characteristics of the modern plane crash that it is studied in flight schools. In fact, what happened to that flight is so similar to what would happen 7 years later in Guam that it's a good place to start our investigation into the mystery of Korean Air's plane crash problem. The captain of the plane was Laureano Cavides. His first officer was Mauricio Klotz. They were en route from Medellin, Colombia, to New York City's Kennedy Airport. The weather that evening was poor. There was a nor'easter up and down the East Coast, bringing with it dense fog and high winds. 203 flights were delayed at Newark Airport. 200 flights were delayed at LaGuardia Airport, 161 at Philadelphia, 53 at Boston's Logan Airport, and 99 at Kennedy. Because of the weather, Avianca was held up by air traffic control 3 times on its way to New York. The plane circled over Norfolk, Virginia, for 19 minutes, above Atlantic City for 29 minutes, and 40 miles south of Kennedy Airport for another 29 minutes. After an hour and a quarter of delay, Avianca was cleared for landing. As the plane came in on its final approach, the pilots encountered severe wind shear. One moment they were flying into a strong headwind, forcing them to add extra power to maintain their momentum on the glide down. The next moment, without warning, the headwind dropped dramatically, and they were traveling much too fast to make the runway. Typically, the plane would have been flying on autopilot in that situation, reacting immediately and appropriately to wind shear. But the autopilot on the plane was malfunctioning, and it had been switched off. At the last moment, the pilot pulled up and executed a go-around. The plane did a wide circle over Long Island and reapproached Kennedy Airport. Suddenly, one of the plane's engines failed. Seconds later, a second engine failed. "Show me the runway," the pilot cried out, hoping desperately that he was close enough to Kennedy to somehow glide his crippled plane to a safe landing. But Kennedy was 16 miles away. The 707 slammed into the estate owned by the father of the tennis champion John McEnroe, in the posh Long Island town of Oyster Bay. 73 of the 158 passengers aboard died. It took less than a day for the cause of the crash to be determined: fuel exhaustion. There was nothing wrong with the aircraft. There was nothing wrong with the airport. The pilots weren't drunk or high. The plane had run out of gas. 4. "It's a classic case," said Surin Ratwat, a veteran pilot who has been involved for years in human factors research, which is the analysis of how human beings interact with complex systems like nuclear power plants and airplanes. Ratwat is Sri Lankan, a lively man in his 40s who has been flying commercial jets his entire adult life. "We were sitting in the lobby of the Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. He just landed a jumbo jet at Kennedy Airport after a long flight from Dubai." Ratwat knew the Avianca case well. He began to tick off the typical crash preconditions. The nor'easter. The delayed flight. The minor technical malfunction with the autopilot. The 3 long holding patterns, which meant not only 80 minutes of extra flying time but extra flying at low altitudes, where a plane burns far more fuel than it does in the thin air high above the clouds. They were flying a 707, which is an older airplane and is very challenging to fly, Ratwat said. "That thing is a lot of work. The flight controls are not hydraulically powered. They are connected by a series of pulleys and pull rods to the physical metal surfaces of the airplane. You have to be quite strong to fly that airplane. You heave it around the sky. It's as much physical effort as rowing a boat. My current airplane I fly with my fingertips. I use a joystick. My instruments are huge. Theirs were the size of coffee cups and his autopilot was gone. So the captain had to keep looking around these 9 instruments, each the size of a coffee cup, while his right hand was controlling the speed, and his left hand was flying the airplane. He was maxed out. He had no resources left to do anything else. That's what happens when you're tired. Your decision-making skills erode. You start missing things that you would pick up on any other day." In the black box recovered from the crash site, Captain Cavides in the final hour of the flight is heard to repeatedly ask for the directions from ATC to be translated into Spanish, as if he no longer had the energy to make use of his English. On 9 occasions, he also asked for directions to be repeated. "Tell me things louder," he said right near the end. "I'm not hearing them." When the plane was circling for 40 minutes just southeast of Kennedy, when everyone on the flight deck clearly knew they were running out of fuel, the pilot could easily have asked to land at Philadelphia, which was just 65 miles away. But he didn't. It was as if he had locked in on New York. On the aborted landing, the plane's ground proximity warning system went off no fewer than 15 times, telling the captain that he was bringing in the plane too low. He seemed oblivious. When he aborted the landing, he should have circled back around immediately, and he didn't. He was exhausted. Through it all, the cockpit was filled with a heavy silence. Sitting next to Cavides was his first officer, Mauricio Klotz, and in the flight recorder, there are long stretches of nothing but rustling and engine noise. It was Klotz's responsibility to conduct all communication with ATC, which meant that his role that night was absolutely critical. But his behavior was oddly passive. It wasn't until the 3rd holding pattern southwest of Kennedy Airport that Klotz told ATC that he didn't think the plane had enough fuel to reach an alternative airport. The next thing the crew heard from ATC was, "Just stand by," and, following that, cleared to the Kennedy Airport. Investigators later surmised that the Avianca pilots must have assumed that ATC was jumping them to the head of the queue, in front of the dozens of other planes circling Kennedy. In fact, they weren't. They were just being added to the end of the line. It was a crucial misunderstanding, upon which the fate of the plane would ultimately rest. But did the pilots raise the issue again, looking for clarification? No. Nor did they bring up the issue of fuel again for another 38 minutes. 5. To Ratwat, the silence in the cockpit made no sense. And as a way of explaining why, Ratwat began to talk about what had happened to him that morning on the way over from Dubai. "We had this lady in the back," he said. "We reckoned she was having a stroke. Seizing. Vomiting. In bad shape. She was an Indian lady whose daughter lives in the States. Her husband spoke no English, no Hindi, only Punjabi. No one could communicate with him. He looked like he had just walked off a village in the Punjab, and they had absolutely no money. I was actually over Moscow when it happened, but I knew we couldn't go to Moscow. I didn't know what would happen to these people if we did. I said to the first officer, 'You fly the plane. We have to go to Helsinki.' The immediate problem Ratwat faced was that they were less than halfway through a very long flight, which meant that they had far more fuel in their tanks than they usually do when it comes time to land. We were 60 tons over maximum landing weight, he said. So now I had to make a choice. I could dump the fuel. But countries hate it when you dump fuel. It's messy stuff, and they would have routed me somewhere over the Baltic Sea, and it would have taken me 40 minutes and the lady probably would have died. So I decided to land anyway. My choice. That meant the plane was landing heavy. They couldn't use the automated landing system because it wasn't set up to handle a plane with that much weight. At that stage, I took over the controls, he went on. I had to ensure that the airplane touched down very softly, otherwise, there would have been the risk of structural damage. It could have been a real mess. There are also performance issues with being heavy. If you clear the runway and have to go around, you may not have enough thrust to climb back up. It was a lot of work. You're juggling a lot of balls. You've got to get it right. Because it was a long flight, there were 2 other pilots. So I got them up, and they got involved in doing everything as well. We had 4 people up there, which really helped in coordinating everything. I'd never been to Helsinki before. I had no idea how the airport was, no idea whether the runways were long enough. I had to find an approach, figure out if we could land there, figure out the performance parameters, and tell the company what we were doing. At one point I was talking to 3 different people, talking to Dubai, talking to Medlink, which is a service in Arizona where they put a doctor on call, and I was talking to the 2 doctors who were attending to the lady in the back. It was non-stop for 40 minutes. We were lucky the weather was very good in Helsinki, he said. Trying to do an approach in bad weather, plus a heavy plane, plus an unfamiliar airport, that's not good. Because it was Finland, a first world country, they were well set up, very flexible. I said to them, "I'm heavy. I would like to land into the wind. You want to slow yourself down in that situation?" They said, "No problem." They landed us in the opposite direction than they normally use. We came in over the city, which they usually avoid for noise reasons. Think about what was required of Ratwat. He had to be a good pilot. That much goes without saying, he had to have the technical skill to land heavy. But almost everything else Ratwat did that made that emergency landing a success fell outside the strict definition of piloting skills. He had to weigh the risk of damaging his plane against the risk to the woman's life, and then, once that choice was made, he had to think through the implications of Helsinki versus Moscow for the sick passenger in the back. He had to educate himself, quickly, on the parameters of an airport he had never seen before. Could it handle one of the biggest jets in the sky, at 60 tons over its normal landing weight? But most of all, he had to talk, to the passengers, to the doctors, to his co-pilot. To the second crew he woke up from their nap, to his superiors back home in Dubai, to ATC at Helsinki. It is safe to say that in the 40 minutes that passed between the passenger's stroke and the landing in Helsinki, there were no more than a handful of seconds of silence in the cockpit. What was required of Ratwatt was that he communicate, and communicate not just in the sense of issuing commands but also in the sense of encouraging and cajoling and calming and negotiating and sharing information in the clearest and most transparent manner possible. 6. Here, by contrast, is the transcript from Avianca 052, as the plane is going in for its abortive first landing. The issue is the weather. The fog is so thick that Klotz and Cavides cannot figure out where they are. Pay close attention, though, not to the content of their conversation but to the form. In particular, note the length of the silences between utterances and to the tone of Klotz's remarks. Cavides, the runway, where is it? I don't see it. I don't see it. They take up the landing gear. The captain tells Klotz to ask for another traffic pattern. 10 seconds pass. Cavides, we don't have fuel. 17 seconds pass as the pilots give technical instructions to each other. Cavides, I don't know what happened with the runway. I didn't see it. Klotz, I didn't see it. Air traffic control comes in and tells them to make a left turn. Cavides, tell them we are in an emergency. Klotz, that's right to 180 on the heading and, we'll try once again. We're running out of fuel. Imagine the scene in the cockpit. The plane is dangerously low on fuel. They have just blown their first shot at a landing. They have no idea how much longer the plane is capable of flying. The captain is desperate, tell them we are in an emergency. And what does Klotz say? That's right to 180 on the heading and, we'll try once again. We're running out of fuel. To begin with, the phrase, running out of fuel, has no meaning in air traffic control terminology. All planes, as they approach their destination, are by definition running out of fuel. Did Klotz mean that 052 no longer had enough fuel to make it to another, alternative airport? Did he mean that they were beginning to get worried about their fuel? Next, consider the structure of the critical sentence. Klotz begins with a routine acknowledgement of the instructions from ATC and doesn't mention his concern about fuel until the second half of the sentence. It's as if he were to say in a restaurant, yes, I'll have some more coffee and, I'm choking on a chicken bone. How seriously would the waiter take him? The air traffic controller with whom Klotz was speaking testified later that he just took it as a passing comment. On stormy nights, air traffic controllers hear pilots talking about running out of fuel all the time. Even the, that Klotz inserts between the two halves of his sentence serves to undercut the importance of what he is saying. According to another of the controllers who handled 052 that night, Klotz spoke, in a very nonchalant manner. There was no urgency in the voice. 7. The term used by linguists to describe what Klotz was engaging in that moment is mitigated speech, which refers to any attempt to downplay or sugarcoat the meaning of what is being said. We mitigate when we're being polite, or when we're ashamed or embarrassed, or when we're being deferential to authority. If you want your boss to do you a favor, you don't say, I'll need this by Monday. You mitigate. You say, don't bother, if it's too much trouble. But if you have a chance to look at this over the weekend, that would be wonderful. In a situation like that, mitigation is entirely appropriate. In other situations, however, like a cockpit on a stormy night, it's a problem. The linguists Ute Fisher and Judith Orasanu once gave the following hypothetical scenario to a group of captains and first officers and asked them how they would respond. You notice on the weather radar an area of heavy precipitation 25 miles ahead. Is maintaining his present course at Mach 73, even though embedded thunderstorms have been reported in your area and you encounter moderate turbulence. You want to ensure that your aircraft will not penetrate this area. Question: what do you say to the pilot? In Fisher's and Orasanu's minds, there were at least 6 ways to try to persuade the pilot to change course and avoid the bad weather, each with a different level of mitigation. 1. Command: turn 30 degrees right. That's the most direct and explicit way of making a point imaginable. It's zero mitigation. 2. Crew obligation statement. I think we need to deviate right about now. Notice the use of we and the fact that the request is now much less specific. That's a little softer. 3. Crew suggestion. Let's go around the weather. Implicit in that statement is, we're in this together. 4. Query. Which direction would you like to deviate? That's even softer than a crew suggestion, because the speaker is conceding that he's not in charge. 5. Preference. I think it would be wise to turn left or right. 6. Hint. That return at 25 miles looks mean. This is the most mitigated statement of all. Fisher and Orasanu found that captains overwhelmingly said they would issue a command in that situation, turn 30 degrees right. They were talking to a subordinate. They had no fear of being blunt. The first officers, on the other hand, were talking to their boss, and so they overwhelmingly chose the most mitigated alternative. They hinted. It's hard to read Fisher and Orasanu's study and not be just a little bit alarmed, because a hint is the hardest kind of request to decode and the easiest to refuse. In the 1982 Air Florida crash outside Washington, D.C., the first officer tried 3 times to tell the captain that the plane had a dangerous amount of ice on its wings. But listen to how he says it. It's all hints. First officer, look how the ice is just hanging on his, back there, see that? Then. First officer, see all those icicles on the back there and everything? And then. First officer, boy, this is a losing battle here on trying to de-ice those things. Give you a false feeling of security, that's all that does. Finally, as they get clearance for takeoff, the first officer upgrades 2 notches to a crew suggestion. First officer, let's check those tops again, since we've been sitting here a while. Captain, I think we get to go here in a minute. The last thing the first officer says to the captain, just before the plane plunges into the Potomac River, is not a hint, a suggestion, or a command. It's a simple statement of fact, and this time the captain agrees with him. First officer, Larry, we're going down, Larry. Captain, I know it. Mitigation explains one of the great anomalies of plane crashes. In commercial airlines, captains and first officers split the flying duties equally. But historically, crashes have been far more likely to happen when the captain is in the flying seat. At first that seems to make no sense, since the captain is almost always the pilot with the most experience. But think about the Air Florida crash. If the first officer had been the captain, would he have hinted 3 times? No, he would have commanded, and the plane wouldn't have crashed. Planes are safer when the least experienced pilot is flying, because it means the second pilot isn't going to be afraid to speak up. Combating mitigation has become one of the great crusades in commercial aviation in the past 15 years. Every major airline now has what is called crew resource management training, which is designed to teach junior crew members how to communicate clearly and assertively. For example, many airlines teach a standardized procedure for co-pilots to challenge the pilot if he or she thinks something has gone terribly awry. Captain, I'm concerned about. Then, Captain, I'm uncomfortable with. And if the captain still doesn't respond, Captain, I believe the situation is unsafe. And if that fails, the first officer is required to take over the airplane. Aviation experts will tell you that it is the success of this war on mitigation as much as anything else that accounts for the extraordinary decline in airline accidents in recent years. On a very simple level, one of the things we insist upon at my airline is that the first officer and the captain call each other by their first names, Ratwatt said. We think that helps. It's just harder to say, Captain, you're doing something wrong, than to use a name. Ratwatt took mitigation very seriously. You couldn't be a student of the Avianca crash and not feel that way. He went on, one thing I personally try to do is, I try to put myself a little down. I say to my co-pilots, I don't fly very often. 3 or 4 times a month. You fly a lot more. If you see me doing something stupid, it's because I don't fly very often. So tell me. Help me out. Hopefully, that helps them speak up. 8. Back to the cockpit of Avianca 052. The plane is now turning away from Kennedy, after the aborted first attempt at landing. Klotz has just been on the radio with ATC, trying to figure out when they can try to land again. Kavitz turns to him. Kavitz, what did he say? Klotz, I already advise him that we are going to attempt again because we can't. 4 seconds of silence pass. Kavitz, advise him we are in emergency. 4 more seconds of silence pass. The captain tries again. Kavitz, did you tell him? Klotz, yes, sir, I already advise him. Klotz starts talking to ATC, going over routine details. Klotz, 150 maintaining 2000 Avianca 052 heavy. The captain is clearly at the edge of panic. Kavitz, advise him we don't have fuel. Klotz gets back on the radio with ATC. Klotz, climb and maintain 3000 and, we're running out of fuel, sir. There it is again. No mention of the magic word, emergency, which is what air traffic controllers are trained to listen for. Just running out of fuel, sir, at the end of a sentence, preceded by the mitigating, If you're counting errors, the Avianca crew is now in double digits. Kavitz, did you already advise that we don't have fuel? Klotz, yes, sir, I already advise him. Kavitz, bueno. If it were not the prelude to a tragedy, their back and forth would resemble an Abbott and Costello comedy routine that a little over a minute passes. ATC, and Avianca 052 heavy, I'm gonna bring you about 15 miles northeast and then turn you back onto the approach. Is that okay with you and your fuel? Klotz, I guess so. Thank you very much. I guess so. Thank you very much. They are about to crash. One of the flight attendants enters the cockpit to find out how serious the situation is. The flight engineer points to the empty fuel gauge, and makes a throat-cutting gesture with his finger. But he says nothing. Nor does anyone else for the next 5 minutes. There's radio chatter and routine business, and then the flight engineer cries out, flame out on engine number 4. Kavitz says, show me the runway, but the runway is 16 miles away. 36 seconds of silence pass. The plane's air traffic controller calls out one last time. ATC, you have enough fuel to make it to the airport? The transcript ends. 9. The thing you have to understand about that crash, Ratwat said, is that New York air traffic controllers are famous for being rude, aggressive, and bullying. They are also very good. They handle a phenomenal amount of traffic in a very constrained environment. There is a famous story about a pilot who got lost trafficking around JFK. You have no idea how easy that is to do at JFK once you're on the ground. It's a maze. Anyway, a female controller got mad at him and said, stop. Don't do anything. Do not talk to me until I talk to you. And she just left him there. Finally the pilot picks up the microphone and says, Madam. Was I married to you in a former life? They are unbelievable. The way they look at it, it's I'm in control. Shut up and do what I say. They will snap at you. And if you don't like what they tell you to do, you have to snap back. And then they'll say, all right, then. But if you don't, they'll railroad you. I remember a British Airways flight was going into New York. They were being stuffed around by New York air traffic control. The British pilot said, you people should go to Heathrow and learn how to control an airplane. It's all in the spirit. If you are not used to that sort of give and take, New York ATC can be very, very intimidating. And those Avianca guys were just intimidated by the rapid fire. It is impossible to imagine Ratwat not making his case to Kennedy ATC, not because he is obnoxious or pushy or has an enormous ego, but because he sees the world differently. If he needed help in the cockpit, he would wake up the second crew. If he thought Moscow was wrong, well, he would just go to Helsinki, and if Helsinki was going to bring him in with the wind, well, he was going to talk them into bringing him in against the wind. That morning, when they were leaving Helsinki, he had lined up the plane on the wrong runway, and his first officer had quickly pointed out the error. The memory made Ratwatt laugh. Massa is Swiss. He was very happy to correct me. He was giving me shit the whole way back. Ratwatt continued, all the guys had to do was tell the controller, we don't have the fuel to comply with what you are trying to do. All they had to do was say, we can't do that. We have to land in the next 10 minutes. They weren't able to put that across to the controller. It was at this point that Ratwatt began to speak carefully, because he was about to make the kind of cultural generalization that often leaves us uncomfortable. But what happened with Avianca was just so strange, so seemingly inexplicable, that it demanded a more complete explanation than simply that Klotz was incompetent and the captain was tired. There was something more profound, more structural, going on in that cockpit. What if there was something about the pilots being Colombian that led to that crash? Look, no American pilot would put up with that. That's the thing, Ratwatt said. They would say, listen, buddy. I have to land. 10. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Dutch psychologist Geert Hofstede was working for the Human Resources Department of IBM's European headquarters. Hofstede's job was to travel the globe and interview employees, asking about such things as how people solved problems and how they worked together and what their attitudes were to authority. The questionnaires were long and involved, and over time Hofstede was able to develop an enormous database for analyzing the ways in which cultures differ from one another. Today, Hofstede's dimensions are among the most widely used paradigms in cross-cultural psychology. Hofstede argued, for example, that cultures can be usefully distinguished according to how much they expect individuals to look after themselves. He called that measurement the individualism-collectivism scale. The country that scores highest on the individualism end of that scale is the United States. Not surprisingly, the United States is also the only industrialized country in the world that does not provide its citizens with universal health care. At the opposite end of the scale is Guatemala. Another of Hofstede's dimensions is uncertainty avoidance. How well does a culture tolerate ambiguity? Here are the top 5 uncertainty avoidance countries, according to Hofstede's database, that is, the countries most reliant on rules and plans and most likely to stick to procedure regardless of circumstances. 1. Greece 2. Portugal 3. Guatemala 4. Uruguay 5. Belgium. The bottom 5, that is, the cultures best able to tolerate ambiguity, are 49, Hong Kong 50. Sweden 51. Denmark 52. Jamaica 53. Singapore. It is important to note that Hofstede wasn't suggesting that there was a right place or a wrong place to be on any one of these scales. Nor was he saying that a culture's position on one of his dimensions was an ironclad predictor of how someone from that country behaves. It's not impossible, for example, for someone from Guatemala to be highly individualistic. What he was saying, instead, was something very similar to what Nisbet and Cohen argued after their hallway studies at the University of Michigan. Each of us has his or her own distinct personality. But overlaid on top of that are tendencies and assumptions and reflexes handed down to us by the history of the community we grew up in, and those differences are extraordinarily specific. Belgium and Denmark are only an hour or so apart by airplane, for example. Danes look a lot like Belgians, and if you were dropped on a street corner in Copenhagen, you wouldn't find it all that different from a street corner in Brussels. But when it comes to uncertainty avoidance, the two nations could not be further apart. In fact, Danes have more in common with Jamaicans when it comes to tolerating ambiguity than they do with some of their European peers. Denmark and Belgium may share in a kind of broad European liberal democratic tradition, but they have different histories, different political structures, different religious traditions, and different languages and food and architecture and literature, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And the sum total of all those differences is that in certain kinds of situations that require dealing with risk, and uncertainty, Danes tend to react in a very different way from Belgians. Of all of Hofstede's dimensions, though, perhaps the most interesting is what he called the Power Distance Index. Power distance is concerned with attitudes toward hierarchy, specifically with how much a particular culture values and respects authority. To measure it, Hofstede asked questions like, how frequently, in your experience, does the following problem occur? Employees being afraid to express disagreement with their managers? To what extent do the less powerful members of organizations and institutions accept and expect that power is distributed unequally? How much are older people respected and feared? Are power holders entitled to special privileges? In low, power distance index countries, Hofstede wrote in his classic text Culture's Consequences. Power is something of which power holders are almost ashamed and they will try to underplay. I once heard a Swedish university official state that in order to exercise power he tried not to look powerful. Leaders may enhance their informal status by renouncing formal symbols. In Austria, Prime Minister Bruno Kreisky was known to sometimes take the streetcar to work. In 1974, I actually saw the Dutch Prime Minister, Joop den Uyl, on vacation with his motorhome at a camping site in Portugal. Such behavior of the powerful would be very unlikely in high PDI. Belgium or France. You can imagine the effect that Hofstede's findings had on people in the aviation industry. What was their great battle over mitigated speech and teamwork all about, after all? It was an attempt to reduce power distance in the cockpit. Hofstede's question about power distance, how frequently, in your experience, does the following problem occur? Employees being afraid to express disagreement with their managers, was the very question aviation experts were asking first officers in their dealings with captains. And Hofstede's work suggested something that had not occurred to anyone in the aviation world, that the task of convincing first officers to assert themselves was going to depend an awful lot on their culture's power distance rating. That's what Ratwatt meant when he said that no American would have been so fatally intimidated by the controllers at Kennedy Airport. America is a classic low, power distance culture. When push comes to shove, Americans fall back on their Americanness, and that Americanness means that the air traffic controller is thought of as an equal. But what country is at the other end of the power distance scale? Colombia. In the wake of the Avianca crash, the psychologist Robert Helmreich, who has done more than anyone to argue for the role of culture in explaining pilot behavior, wrote a brilliant analysis of the accident in which he argued that you couldn't understand Klotz's behavior without taking into account his nationality, that his predicament that day was uniquely the predicament of someone who had a deep and abiding respect for authority. Helmreich wrote, "The high, power distance of Colombians could have created frustration on the part of the first officer because the captain failed to show the kind of clear decision-making expected in high, power distance cultures. The first and second officers may have been waiting for the captain to make decisions, but still may have been unwilling to pose alternatives. Klotz sees himself as a subordinate. It's not his job to solve the crisis. It's the captain's, and the captain is exhausted and isn't saying anything. Then there's the domineering Kennedy Airport air traffic controllers ordering the planes around. Klotz is trying to tell them he's in trouble. But he's using his own cultural language, speaking as a subordinate would to a superior. The controllers, though, aren't Colombian. They're low, power distance New Yorkers. They don't see any hierarchical gap between themselves and the pilots in the air, and to them, mitigated speech from a pilot doesn't mean the speaker is being appropriately deferential to a superior. It means the pilot doesn't have a problem. There is a point in the transcript where the cultural miscommunication between the controllers and Klotz becomes so evident that it is almost painful to read. It's the last exchange between Avianca and the control tower, just minutes before the crash. Klotz has just said, "I guess so. Thank you very much," in response to the controller's question about their fuel state. Captain Cavides then turns to Klotz. "Cavides, what did he say?" "Klotz, the guy is angry." "Angry." Klotz's feelings are hurt. His plane is moments from disaster. But he cannot escape the dynamic dictated to him by his culture, in which subordinates must respect the dictates of their superiors. In his mind, he has tried and failed to communicate his plight, and his only conclusion is that he must have somehow offended his superiors in the control tower. In the aftermath of the Kennedy crash, the management of Avianca Airlines held a post-mortem. Avianca had just had 4 accidents in quick succession: Barranquilla, Cucuta, Madrid, and New York, and all 4 cases, the airline concluded, had to do with airplanes in perfect flight condition. Aircrew without physical limitations and considered of average or above average flight ability, and still the accidents happened. In the company's Madrid crash, the report went on, the co-pilot tried to warn the captain about how dangerous the situation was. The co-pilot was right. But they died because when the co-pilot asked questions, his implied suggestions were very weak. The captain's reply was to ignore him totally. Perhaps the co-pilot did not want to appear rebellious, questioning the judgment of the captain, or he did not want to play the fool because he knew that the pilot had a great deal of experience flying in that area. The co-pilot should have advocated for his own opinions in a stronger way. Our ability to succeed at what we do is powerfully bound up with where we're from, and being a good pilot and coming from a high, power distance culture is a difficult mix. Colombia by no means has the highest PDI, by the way. Helmreich and a colleague, Ashley Merritt, once measured the PDI of pilots from around the world. Number 1 was Brazil. Number 2 was South Korea. 11. The National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. agency responsible for investigating plane crashes, is headquartered in a squat, 70s-era office building on the banks of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Off the agency's long hallways are laboratories filled with airplane wreckage, a mangled piece of an engine turbine, a problematic piece of a helicopter rotor. On a shelf in one of the laboratories is the cockpit voice and data recorder, the so-called black box. From the devastating ValueJet crash in Florida in 1996, in which 110 people were killed. The recorder is encased in a shoe box, size housing made out of thick hardened steel, and on one end of the box is a jagged hole, as if someone, or, rather, something, had driven a stake into it with tremendous force. Some of the NTSB investigators are engineers, who reconstruct crashes from the material evidence. Others are pilots. A surprising number of them, however, are psychologists, whose job it is to listen to the cockpit recorder and reconstruct what was said and done by the flight crew in the final minutes before a crash. One of the NTSB's leading black box specialists is a gangly 50-ish PhD psychologist named Malcolm Brenner, and Brenner was one of the investigators into the Korean air crash in Guam. Normally that approach into Guam is not difficult, Brenner began. Guam Airport has what is called a glide scope, which is like a giant beam of light stretching up into the sky from the airport, and the pilot simply follows the beam all the way down to the runway. But on this particular night, the glide slope was down. It was out of service, Brenner said. It had been sent to another island to be repaired. So there was a notice to airmen that the glide slope was not operating. In the grand scheme of things, this should not have been a big problem. In the month the glide scope had been under repair, there had been about 1,500 safe landings at Guam Airport. It was just a small thing, an inconvenience, really, that made the task of landing a plane just a little bit more difficult. The second complication was the weather, Brenner continued. Normally in the South Pacific, you've got these brief weather situations. But they go by quickly. You don't have storms. It's a tropical paradise. But that night, there were some little cells, and it just happens that that evening, they were going to be flying into one of those little cells, a few miles from the airport. So the captain has to decide, what exactly is my procedure for landing? Well, they were cleared for what's called a VOR-DME approach. It's complicated. It's a pain in the ass. It takes a lot of coordination to set it up. You have to come down in steps. But then, as it happens, from miles out, the captain sees the lights of Guam. So he relaxes. And he says, "We're doing a visual approach." The viewer is a beacon that sends out a signal that allows pilots to calculate their altitude as they approach an airport. It's what pilots relied on before the invention of the glide scope. The captain's strategy was to use the viewer to get the plane close and then, once he could see the lights of the runway, to land the plane visually. It seemed to make sense. Pilots do visual landings all the time. But every time a pilot chooses a plan, he is supposed to prepare a backup in case things go awry. And this captain didn't. They should have been coordinating. He should have been briefing for the step-downs, Brenner went on. But he doesn't talk about that. The storm cells are all around them, and what the captain seems to be doing is assuming that at some point he's going to break out of the clouds and see the airport, and if he doesn't see it by 560 feet, he'll just go around. Now, that would work, except for one more thing. The viewer on which he's basing this strategy is not at the airport. It's 2.5 miles away on Nimitz Hill. There's a number of airports in the world where this is true. Sometimes you can follow the viewer down and it takes you straight to the airport. Here if you follow the viewer down, it takes you straight to Nimitz Hill. The pilot knew about the viewer. It was clearly stated in the airport's navigational charts. He'd flown into Guam 8 times before, and in fact, he had specifically mentioned it in the briefing he gave before takeoff. But then again, it was 1 in the morning, and he'd been up since 6 a.m. the previous day. We believe that fatigue was involved, Brenner went on. It's a back-of-the-clock flight. You fly in and arrive at 1 in the morning, Korean time. Then you spend a few hours on the ground, and you fly back as the sun is coming up. The captain has flown it a month before. In that case, he slept on the first-class seat. Now he's flying in and says he's really tired. So there they are, 3 classic preconditions of a plane crash, the same 3 that set the stage for Avianca 052, a minor technical malfunction, bad weather, and a tired pilot. By itself, none of these would be sufficient for an accident. But all 3 in combination require the combined efforts of everyone in the cockpit. And that's where Korean Air 801 ran into trouble. 12. Here is the flight recorder transcript of the final 30 minutes of KAL Flight 801. It begins with the captain complaining of exhaustion. 0120:01, Captain, if this round trip is more than a 9-hour trip, we might get a little something. With 8 hours, we get nothing. 8 hours do not help us at all. They make us work to maximum, up to maximum. Probably this way. Hotel expenses will be saved for cabin crews, and maximize the flight hours. Anyway, they make us work to maximum. There is the sound of a man shifting in his seat. A minute passes. 0121:13, Captain, really sleepy. First officer, of course. Then comes one of the most critical moments in the flight. The first officer decides to speak up. First officer, don't you think it rains more in this area, here? The first officer must have thought long and hard before making that comment. He was not flying in the easy collegiality of Surin Ratwat's cockpit. Among Korean Air flight crews, the expectation on layovers used to be that the junior officers would attend to the captain to the point of making him dinner or purchasing him gifts. As one former Korean Air pilot puts it, the sensibility in many of the airline's cockpits was that the captain is in charge and does what he wants, when he likes, how he likes, and everyone else sits quietly and does nothing. In the Delta report on Korean Air that was posted anonymously on the internet, one of the auditors tells a story of sitting in on a Korean Air flight where the first officer got confused while listening to air traffic control and mistakenly put the plane on a course intended for another plane. The flight engineer picked up something was wrong but said nothing. First officer was also not happy but said nothing. Despite visual conditions, crew did not look out and see that current heading would not bring them to the airfield. Finally the plane's radar picks up the mistake, and then comes the key sentence: Captain hit first officer with the back of his hand for making the error. Hit him with the back of his hand? When the 3 pilots all met that evening at Kimpo for their pre-flight preparation, the first officer and the engineer would have bowed to the captain. They would all have then shaken hands. Chio eom bob siam nida, the co-pilot might have said, respectfully. It is first time to meet you. The Korean language has no fewer than 6 different levels of conversational address, depending on the relationship between the addressee and the addresser: formal deference, informal deference, blunt, familiar, intimate, and plain. The first officer would not have dared to use one of the more intimate or familiar forms when he addressed the captain. This is a culture in which enormous attention is paid to the relative standing of any two people in a conversation. The Korean linguist Ho Min Son writes, "At a dinner table, a lower-ranking person must wait until a higher-ranking person sits down and starts eating, while the reverse does not hold true. One does not smoke in the presence of a social superior, when drinking with a social superior. The subordinate hides his glass and turns away from the superior. In greeting a social superior, a Korean must bow, a Korean must rise when an obvious social superior appears on the scene, and he cannot pass in front of an obvious social superior. All social behavior and actions are conducted in the order of seniority or ranking. As the saying goes, chamel to y alai kaida, there is order even to drinking cold water. So, when the first officer says, 'Don't you think it rains more?' In this area, here, we know what he means by that, Captain. You have committed us to visual approach, with no backup plan, and the weather outside is terrible. You think that we will break out of the clouds in time to see the runway. But what if we don't? It's pitch black outside and pouring rain and the glide scope is down." But he can't say that. He hints, and in his mind he said as much as he can to a superior. The first officer will not mention the weather again. It is just after that moment that the plane, briefly, breaks out of the clouds, and off in the distance the pilots see lights. "Is it Guam?" the flight engineer asks. Then, after a pause, he says, "It's Guam, Guam." The captain chuckles. Good. But it isn't good. It's an illusion. They've come out of the clouds for a moment. But they are still 20 miles from the airport, and there is an enormous amount of bad weather still ahead of them. The flight engineer knows this, because it is his responsibility to track the weather, so now he decides to speak up. "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot," he says. The weather radar has helped us a lot. A second hint from the flight deck. What the engineer means is just what the first officer meant. This isn't a night where you can rely on just your eyes to land the plane. Look at what the weather radar is telling us: there's trouble ahead. To Western ears, it seems strange that the flight engineer would bring up this subject just once. Western communication has what linguists call a transmitter orientation, that is, it is considered the responsibility of the speaker to communicate ideas clearly and unambiguously. Even in the tragic case of the Air Florida crash, where the first officer never does more than hint about the danger posed by the ice, he still hints 4 times, phrasing his comments 4 different ways, in an attempt to make his meaning clear. He may have been constrained by the power distance between himself and the captain, but he was still operating within a Western cultural context, which holds that if there is confusion, it is the fault of the speaker. But Korea, like many Asian countries, is receiver-oriented. It is up to the listener to make sense of what is being said. In the engineer's mind, he has said a lot. Son gives the following conversation as an illustration: an exchange between an employee and his boss, a division chief. "Kwa Chang, it's cold and I'm kind of hungry. Mr. Kim, how about having a glass of liquor?" "Kwa Chang, it's okay. Don't bother. Mr. Kim, you must be hungry. How about going out?" "Kwa Chang, shall I do so?" There is something beautiful in the subtlety of that exchange, in the attention that each party must pay to the motivations and desires of the other. It is civilized, in the truest sense of that word. It does not permit insensitivity or indifference. But high-power distance communication works only when the listener is capable of paying close attention, and it works only if the two parties in a conversation have the luxury of time, in order to unwind each other's meanings. It doesn't work in an airplane cockpit on a stormy night with an exhausted pilot trying to land at an airport with a broken glide scope. 13. In 2000, Korean Air finally acted, bringing in an outsider from Delta Air Lines, David Greenberg, to run their flight operations. Greenberg's first step was something that would make no sense if you did not understand the true roots of Korean Air's problems. He evaluated the English language skills of all of the airline's flight crews. Some of them were fine and some of them weren't, he remembers. So we set up a program to assist and improve the proficiency of aviation English. His second step was to bring in a Western firm, a subsidiary of Boeing called Altion, to take over the company's training and instruction programs. Altion conducted their training in English, Greenberg says. They didn't speak Korean. Greenberg's rule was simple. The new language of Korean Air was English, and if you wanted to remain a pilot at the company, you had to be fluent in that language. This was not a purge, he says. Everyone had the same opportunity, and those who found the language issue challenging were allowed to go out and study on their own nickel. But language was the filter. I can't recall that anyone was fired for flying proficiency shortcomings. Greenberg's rationale was that English was the language of the aviation world. When the pilots sat in the cockpit and worked their way through the written checklists that flight crews follow on every significant point of procedure, those checklists were in English. When they talked to air traffic control anywhere in the world, those conversations would be in English. If you are trying to land at JFK at rush hour, there is no nonverbal communication, Greenberg says. It's people talking to people, so you need to be darn sure you understand what's going on. You can say that two Koreans side by side don't need to speak English. But if they are arguing about what the guys outside said in English, then language is important. Greenberg wanted to give his pilots an alternate identity. Their problem was that they were trapped in roles dictated by the heavy weight of their country's cultural legacy. They needed an opportunity to step outside those roles when they sat in the cockpit, and language was the key to that transformation. In English, they would be free of the sharply defined gradients of Korean hierarchy: formal deference, informal deference, blunt, familiar, intimate, and plain. Instead, the pilots could participate in a culture and language with a very different legacy. The crucial part of Greenberg's reform, however, is what he didn't do. He didn't throw up his hands in despair. He didn't fire all of his Korean pilots and start again with pilots from a low, power distance culture. He knew that cultural legacies matter, that they are powerful and pervasive, and that they persist long after their original usefulness has passed. But he didn't assume that legacies are an indelible part of who we are. He believed that if the Koreans were honest about where they came from and were willing to confront those aspects of their heritage that did not suit the aviation world, they could change. He offered his pilots what everyone from hockey players to software tycoons to takeover lawyers has been offered on the way to success: an opportunity to transform their relationship to their work. After leaving Korean Air, Greenberg helped start up a freight airline called Cargo 360, and he took a number of Korean pilots with him. They were all flight engineers, who had been number 3, after the captain and first officer, in the strict hierarchy of the original Korean Air. These were guys who had performed in the old environment at Korean Air for as much as 15 to 18 years, he said. They had accepted that subservient role. They had been at the bottom of the ladder. We retrained them and put them with Western crew. They've been a great success. They all changed their style. They take initiative. They pull their share of the load. They don't wait for someone to direct them. These are senior people, in their 50s, with a long history in one context, who have been retrained and are now successful doing their job in a Western cockpit. We took them out of their culture and renormed them. That is an extraordinarily liberating example. When we understand what it really means to be a good pilot, when we understand how much culture and history and the world outside of the individual matter to professional success, then we don't have to throw up our hands in despair at an airline where pilots crash planes into the sides of mountains. We have a way to make successes out of the unsuccessful. But first we have to be frank about a subject that we would all too often rather ignore. In 1994, when Boeing first published safety data showing a clear correlation between a country's plane crashes and its score on Hofstede's dimensions, the company's researchers practically tied themselves in knots trying not to cause offense. "We're not saying there's anything here, but we think there's something there," is how Boeing's chief engineer for airplane safety put it. Why are we so squeamish? Why is the fact that each of us comes from a culture with its own distinctive mix of strengths and weaknesses, tendencies and predispositions, so difficult to acknowledge? Who we are cannot be separated from where we're from, and when we ignore that fact, planes crash. 14. Back to the cockpit. "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot." No pilot would say that now. But this was in 1997, before Korean Air took its power distance issues seriously. The captain was tired, and the engineer's true meaning sailed over the captain's head. "Yes," the captain says in response. "They are very useful." He isn't listening. The plane is flying toward the VOR beacon and the VOR is on the side of a mountain. The weather hasn't broken, so the pilots can't see anything. The captain puts the landing gear down and extends the flaps. At 1 hour 41 minutes and 48 seconds, the captain says, "Wiper on," and the flight engineer turns the wipers on. "It's raining now at 1 hour 41 minutes and 59 seconds, the first officer asks, "Not in sight?" He's looking for the runway. He can't see it. He's had a sinking feeling in his stomach for some time now. 1 second later, the ground proximity warning system calls out in its toneless electronic voice, 500, the plane is 500 feet off the ground. The ground in this case is the side of Nimitz Hill. But the crew is confused because they think that the ground means the runway, and how can that be if they can't see the runway? The flight engineer says, in an astonished tone of voice. You can imagine them all thinking furiously, trying to square their assumption of where the plane is with what their instruments are telling them. At 1 hour 42 minutes and 19 seconds, the first officer says, "Let's make a missed approach." He has finally upgraded from a hint to a crew obligation. He wants to abort the landing. Later, in the crash investigation, it was determined that if he had seized control of the plane in that moment, there would have been enough time to pull up the nose and clear Nimitz Hill. That is what first officers are trained to do when they believe a captain is clearly in the wrong. But it is one thing to learn that in a classroom, and quite another to actually do it in the air, with someone who might rap you with the back of his hand if you make a mistake. 1 hour 42 minutes and 20 seconds, flight engineer, not in sight. With disaster staring them in the face, both the first officer and the engineer have finally spoken up. They want the captain to go around, to pull up and start the landing over again. But it's too late. 1 hour 42 minutes and 21 seconds, first officer, not in sight, missed approach. 1 hour 42 minutes and 22 seconds, flight engineer, go around. 1 hour 42 minutes and 23 seconds, captain, go around. 1:42:24:05, ground proximity warning system, 100. 1:42:24:84, GPWS, 50. 1:42:25:19, GPWS, 40. 1:42:25:50, GPWS, 30. 1:42:25:78, GPWS, 20. 1:42:25:78, 1:42:28:65. 1:42:28:91, 1:42:30:54. End of recording. Chapter 8. Rice Paddies and Math Tests. No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich. 1. The gateway to the industrial heartland of southern China runs up through the wide, verdant swath of the Pearl River Delta. The land is covered by a thick, smoggy haze. The freeways are crammed with tractor-trailers. Power lines crisscross the landscape. Factories making cameras, computers, watches, umbrellas, and t-shirts stand cheek by jowl with densely packed blocks of apartment buildings and fields of banana and mango trees, sugarcane, papaya, and pineapple destined for the export market. Few landscapes in the world have changed so much in so short a time. A generation ago, the skies would have been clear and the road would have been a 2-lane highway. And a generation before that, all you would have seen were rice paddies. 2 hours in, at the headwaters of the Pearl River, lies the city of Guangzhou, and past Guangzhou, remnants of the old China are easier to find. The countryside becomes breathtakingly beautiful, rolling hills dotted with outcroppings of limestone rock against the backdrop of the Nanling Mountains. Here and there are the traditional khaki-colored mud brick huts of the Chinese peasantry. In the small towns, there are open-air markets, chickens and geese in elaborate bamboo baskets, vegetables laid out in rows on the ground, slabs of pork on tables, tobacco being sold in big clumps. And everywhere, there is rice, miles upon miles of it. In the winter season, the paddies are dry and dotted with the stubble of the previous year's crop. After the crops are planted in early spring, as the humid winds begin to blow, they turn a magical green, and by the time of the first harvest, as the grains emerge on the ends of the rice shoots, the land becomes an unending sea of yellow. Rice has been cultivated in China for thousands of years. It was from China that the techniques of rice cultivation spread throughout East Asia, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Year in, year out, as far back as history is recorded, farmers from across Asia have engaged in the same relentless, intricate pattern of agriculture. Rice paddies are built, not opened up, the way a wheat field is. You don't just clear the trees, underbrush, and stones and then plow. Rice fields are carved into mountainsides in an elaborate series of terraces, or painstakingly constructed from marshland and river plains. A rice paddy has to be irrigated, so a complex system of dikes has to be built around the field. Channels must be dug from the nearest water source, and gates built into the dike so the water flow can be adjusted precisely to cover the right amount of the plant. The paddy itself, meanwhile, has to have a hard clay floor, otherwise the water will simply seep into the ground. But of course, rice seedlings can't be planted in hard clay, so on top of the clay, there has to be a thick, soft layer of mud. And the clay pan, as it's called, has to be carefully engineered so that it will drain properly and also keep the plant submerged at the optimum level. Rice has to be fertilized repeatedly, which is another art. Traditionally, farmers used night soil and a combination of burned compost, river mud, bean cake, and hemp, and they had to be careful, because too much fertilizer, or the right amount applied at the wrong time, could be as bad as too little. When the time came to plant, a Chinese farmer would have hundreds of different varieties of rice from which to choose, each one of which offered a slightly different trade-off, say, between yield and how quickly it grew, or how well it did in times of drought, or how it fared in poor soil. A farmer might plant a dozen or more different varieties at one time, adjusting the mix from season to season in order to manage the risk of a crop failure. He or she would plant the seed in a specially prepared seedbed. After a few weeks, the seedlings would be transplanted into the field, in carefully spaced rows 6 inches apart, and then painstakingly nurtured. Weeding was done by hand, diligently and unceasingly, because the seedlings could easily be choked by other plant life. Sometimes each rice shoot would be individually groomed with a bamboo comb to clear away insects. All the while, farmers had to check and recheck water levels and make sure the water didn't get too hot in the summer sun. And when the rice ripened, farmers gathered all of their friends and relatives and, in one coordinated burst, harvested it as quickly as possible so they could get a second crop in before the winter dry season began. Breakfast in South China, at least for those who could afford it, was congee, white rice porridge, with lettuce and dace paste and bamboo shoots. Lunch was more congee. Dinner was rice with toppings. Rice was what you sold at the market to buy the other necessities of life. It was how wealth and status were measured. It dictated almost every working moment of every day. Rice is life, says the anthropologist Goncalo Santos, who has studied a traditional South Chinese village. Without rice, you don't survive. If you want to be anyone in this part of China, you would have to have rice. It made the world go around. 2. Take a look at the following list of numbers: 4, 8, 5, 3, 9, 7, 6. Read them out loud. Now look away and spend 20 seconds memorizing that sequence before saying them out loud again. If you speak English, you have about a 50% chance of remembering that sequence perfectly. If you're Chinese, though, you're almost certain to get it right every time. Why is that? Because as human beings we store digits in a memory loop that runs for about 2 seconds. We most easily memorize whatever we can say or read within that 2-second span. And Chinese speakers get that list of numbers, 4, 8, 5, 3, 9, 7, 6, right almost every time because, unlike English, their language allows them to fit all those 7 numbers into 2 seconds. That example comes from Stanislas Dehaene's book The Number Sense. As Dehaene explains, Chinese number words are remarkably brief. Most of them can be uttered in less than 1/4 of a second. Their English equivalents, 4, 7, are longer, pronouncing them takes about 1/3 of a second. The memory gap between English and Chinese apparently is entirely due to this difference in length. In languages as diverse as Welsh, Arabic, Chinese, English, and Hebrew, there is a reproducible correlation between the time required to pronounce numbers in a given language and the memory span of its speakers. In this domain, the prize for efficacy goes to the Cantonese dialect of Chinese, whose brevity grants residents of Hong Kong a rocketing memory span of about 10 digits. It turns out that there is also a big difference in how number naming systems in Western and Asian languages are constructed. In English, we say 14, 16, 17, 18, and 19, so one might expect that we would also say 1-teen, 2-teen, 3-teen, and 5-teen. But we don't. We use a different form, 11, 12, 13, and 15. Similarly, we have 40 and 60, which sound like the words they are related to. But we also say 50 and 30 and 20, which sort of sound like 5 and 3 and 2, but not really. And, for that matter, for numbers above 20, we put the decade first and the unit number second, whereas for the teens, we do it the other way around. The number system in English is highly irregular. Not so in China, Japan, and Korea. They have a logical counting system. 11 is 10-1. 12 is 10-2. 24 is 2 10s 4 and so on. That difference means that Asian children learn to count much faster than American children. 4-year-old Chinese children can count, on average, to 40. American children at that age can count only to 15, and most don't reach 40 until they're 5. By the age of 5, in other words, American children are already a year behind their Asian counterparts in the most fundamental of math skills. The regularity of their number system also means that Asian children can perform basic functions, such as addition, far more easily. Ask an English-speaking 7-year-old to add 37 plus 22 in her head, and she has to convert the words to numbers. Only then can she do the math. 2 plus 7 is 9 and 30 and 20 is 50, which makes 59. Ask an Asian child to add 3 10s 7 and 2 10s 2, and then the necessary equation is right there, embedded in the sentence. No number translation is necessary, it's Fivedens 9. The Asian system is transparent, says Karen Fusen, a Northwestern University psychologist who has closely studied Asian-Western differences. I think that it makes the whole attitude toward math different. Instead of being a rote learning thing, there's a pattern I can figure out. There is an expectation that I can do this. There is an expectation that it's sensible. For fractions, we say 3/5. The Chinese is literally out of 5 parts, take 3. That's telling you conceptually what a fraction is. It's differentiating the denominator and the numerator. The much-storied disenchantment with mathematics among Western children starts in the 3rd and 4th grades, and Fusen argues that perhaps a part of that disenchantment is due to the fact that math doesn't seem to make sense. Its linguistic structure is clumsy. Its basic rules seem arbitrary and complicated. Asian children, by contrast, don't feel nearly that same bafflement. They can hold more numbers in their heads and do calculations faster, and the way fractions are expressed in their languages corresponds exactly to the way a fraction actually is, and maybe that makes them a little more likely to enjoy math, and maybe because they enjoy math a little more, they try a little harder and take more math classes and are more willing to do their homework, and on, in a kind of virtuous circle. When it comes to math, in other words, Asians have a built-in advantage. But it's an unusual kind of advantage. For years, students from China, South Korea, and Japan, and the children of recent immigrants who are from those countries, have substantially outperformed their Western counterparts at mathematics, and the typical assumption is that it has something to do with a kind of innate Asian proclivity for math. The psychologist Richard Lynn has even gone so far as to propose an elaborate evolutionary theory involving the Himalayas, really cold weather, pre-modern hunting practices, brain size, and specialized vowel sounds, to explain why Asians have higher IQs. That's how we think about math. We assume that being good at things like calculus and algebra is a simple function of how smart someone is. But the differences between the number systems in the East and the West suggest something very different, that being good at math may also be rooted in a group's culture. In the case of the Koreans, one kind of deeply rooted legacy stood in the way of the very modern task of flying an airplane. Here we have another kind of legacy, one that turns out to be perfectly suited for 21st century tasks. Cultural legacies matter, and once we've seen the surprising effects of such things as power distance and numbers that can be said in a quarter as opposed to a third of a second, it's hard not to wonder how many other cultural legacies have an impact on our 21st century intellectual tasks. What if coming from a culture shaped by the demands of growing rice also makes you better at math? Could the rice paddy make a difference in the classroom? 3. The most striking fact about a rice paddy, which can never quite be grasped until you actually stand in the middle of one, is its size. It's tiny. The typical rice paddy is about as big as a hotel room. A typical Asian rice farm might be composed of 2 or 3 paddies. A village in China of 1,500 people might support itself entirely with 450 acres of land, which in the American Midwest would be the size of a typical family farm. At that scale, with families of 5 and 6 people living off a farm the size of 2 hotel rooms, agriculture changes dramatically. Historically, Western agriculture is mechanically oriented. In the West, if a farmer wanted to become more efficient or increase his yield, he introduced more and more sophisticated equipment, which allowed him to replace human labor with mechanical labor, a threshing machine, a hay baler, a combine harvester, a tractor. He cleared another field and increased his acreage, because now his machinery allowed him to work more land with the same amount of effort. But in Japan or China, farmers didn't have the money to buy equipment, and, in any case, there certainly wasn't any extra land that could easily be converted into new fields. So rice farmers improved their yields by becoming smarter, by being better managers of their own time, and by making better choices. As the anthropologist Francesca Bray puts it, rice agriculture is skill-oriented. If you're willing to weed a bit more diligently, and become more adept at fertilizing, and spend a bit more time monitoring water levels, and do a better job keeping the claypan absolutely level, and make use of every square inch of your rice paddy, you'll harvest a bigger crop. Throughout history, not surprisingly, the people who grow rice have always worked harder than almost any other kind of farmer. That last statement may seem a little odd, because most of us have a sense that everyone in the pre-modern world worked really hard. But that simply isn't true. All of us, for example, are descended at some point from hunter-gatherers, and many hunter-gatherers, by all accounts, had a pretty leisurely life. The Bkung Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, in Botswana, who are one of the last remaining practitioners of that way of life, subsist on a rich assortment of fruits, berries, roots, and nuts, in particular the mangongo nut. An incredibly plentiful and protein-rich source of food that lies thick on the ground. They don't grow anything, and it is growing things, preparing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing, that takes time. Nor do they raise any animals. Occasionally, the male, Kung hunt, but chiefly for sport. All told, Kung men and women work no more than about 12 to 19 hours a week, with the balance of the time spent dancing, entertaining, and visiting family and friends. That's, at most, 1,000 hours of work a year. Or consider the life of a peasant in 18th century Europe. Men and women in those days probably worked from dawn to noon 200 days a year, which works out to about 1,200 hours of work annually. During harvest or spring planting, the day might be longer. In the winter, much less. In The Discovery of France, the historian Graham Robb argues that peasant life in a country like France, even well into the 19th century, was essentially brief episodes of work followed by long periods of idleness. 99% of all human activity described in this and other accounts, he writes, took place between late spring and early autumn. In the Pyrenees and the Alps, entire villages would essentially hibernate from the time of the first snow in November until March or April. In more temperate regions of France, where temperatures in the winter rarely fell below freezing, the same pattern held. Robb continues. The fields of Flanders were deserted for much of the year. An official report on the Nièvre in 1844 described the strange mutation of the Burgundian day labor once the harvest was in and the vine stalks had been burned. After making the necessary repairs to their tools, these vigorous men will now spend their days in bed, packing their bodies tightly together in order to stay warm and eat less food. They weaken themselves deliberately. Human hibernation was a physical and economic necessity. Lowering the metabolic rate prevented hunger from exhausting supplies. People trudged and dawdled, even in summer. After the Revolution, in Alsace and the Pas-de-Calais, officials complained that wine growers and independent farmers, instead of undertaking some peaceful and sedentary industry in the quieter season, abandoned themselves to dumb idleness. If you were a peasant farmer in southern China, by contrast, you didn't sleep through the winter. In the short break marked by the dry season, from November through February, you busied yourself with side tasks. You made bamboo baskets or hats and sold them in the market. You repaired the dikes in your rice paddy, and rebuilt your mud hut. You sent one of your sons to work in a nearby village for a relative. You made tofu and dried bean curd and caught snakes and trapped insects. By the time Lop Chun came, you were back in the fields at dawn. Working in a rice field is 10 to 20 times more labor-intensive than working on an equivalent-size corn or wheat field. Some estimates put the annual workload of a wet rice farmer in Asia at 3,000 hours a year. 4. Think, for a moment, about what the life of a rice farmer in the Pearl River Delta must have been like. 3,000 hours a year is a staggering amount of time to spend working, particularly if many of those hours involve being bent over in the hot sun, planting and weeding in a rice paddy. What redeemed the life of a rice farmer, however, was the nature of that work. It was a lot like the garment work done by the Jewish immigrants to New York. It was meaningful. First of all, there is a clear relationship in rice farming between effort and reward. The harder you work a rice field, the more it yields. Second, it's complex work. The rice farmer isn't simply planting in the spring and harvesting in the fall. He or she effectively runs a small business, juggling a family workforce, hedging uncertainty through seed selection, building and managing a sophisticated irrigation system, and coordinating the complicated process of harvesting the first crop while simultaneously preparing the second crop. And, most of all, it's autonomous. The peasants of Europe worked essentially as low-paid slaves of an aristocratic landlord, with little control over their own destinies. But China and Japan never developed that kind of oppressive feudal system, because feudalism simply can't work in a rice economy. Growing rice is too complicated and intricate for a system that requires farmers to be coerced and bullied into going out into the fields each morning. By the 14th and 15th centuries, landlords in central and southern China had an almost completely hands-off relationship with their tenants. They would collect a fixed rent and let farmers go about their business. The thing about wet rice farming is, not only do you need phenomenal amounts of labor, but it's very exacting, says the historian Kenneth Pomerantz. You have to care. It really matters that the field is perfectly leveled before you flood it. Getting it close to level but not quite right makes a big difference in terms of your yield. It really matters that the water is in the fields for just the right amount of time. There's a big difference between lining up the seedlings at exactly the right distance and doing it sloppily. It's not like you put the corn in the ground in mid-March and as long as rain comes by the end of the month, you're okay. You're controlling all the inputs in a very direct way. And when you have something that requires that much care, the overlord has to have a system that gives the actual laborer some set of incentives, where if the harvest comes out well, the farmer gets a bigger share. That's why you get fixed rents, where the landlord says, I get 20 bushels, regardless of the harvest, and if it's really good, you get the extra. It's a crop that doesn't do very well with something like slavery or wage labor. It would just be too easy to leave the gate that controls the irrigation water open a few seconds too long and there goes your field. The historian David Arkush once compared Russian and Chinese peasant proverbs, and the differences are striking. If God does not bring it, the earth will not give it, is a typical Russian proverb. That's the kind of fatalism and pessimism typical of a repressive feudal system, where peasants have no reason to believe in the efficacy of their own work. On the other hand, Arkush writes, Chinese proverbs are striking in their belief that hard work, shrewd planning and self-reliance or cooperation with a small group will in time bring recompense. Here are some of the things that penniless peasants would say to one another as they worked 3,000 hours a year in the baking heat and humidity of Chinese rice paddies. No food without blood and sweat. Farmers are busy, farmers are busy. If farmers weren't busy, where would grain to get through the winter come from? In winter, the lazy man freezes to death. Don't depend on heaven for food, but on your own 2 hands carrying the load. Useless to ask about the crops, it all depends on hard work and fertilizer. If a man works hard, the land will not be lazy. And, most telling of all, no one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich. Rise before dawn. 360 days a year? For the Kung leisurely gathering mangongo nuts, or the French peasant sleeping away the winter, or anyone else living in something other than the world of rice cultivation, that proverb would be unthinkable. This is not, of course, an unfamiliar observation about Asian culture. Go to any Western college campus and you'll find that Asian students have a reputation for being in the library long after everyone else has left. Sometimes people of Asian background get offended when their culture is described this way, because they think that the stereotype is being used as a form of disparagement. But a belief in work ought to be a thing of beauty. Virtually every success story we've seen in this book so far involves someone or some group working harder than their peers. Bill Gates was addicted to his computer as a child. So was Bill Joy. The Beatles put in thousands of hours of practice in Hamburg. Joe Flom ground away for years, perfecting the art of takeovers, before he got his chance. Working really hard is what successful people do, and the genius of the culture formed in the rice paddies is that hard work gave those in the fields a way to find meaning in the midst of great uncertainty and poverty. That lesson has served Asians well in many endeavors but rarely so perfectly as in the case of mathematics. 5. A few years ago, Alan Schoenfeld, a math professor at Berkeley, made a videotape of a woman named Renee as she was trying to solve a math problem. Renee was in her mid-20s, with long black hair and round silver glasses. In the tape, she's playing with a software program designed to teach algebra. On the screen are a y and an x-axis. The program asks the user to punch in a set of coordinates and then draws the line from those coordinates on the screen. For example, when she typed in 5 on the y-axis and 5 on the x-axis, the computer did this. At this point, I'm sure, some vague memory of your middle school algebra is coming back to you. But rest assured, you don't need to remember any of it to understand the significance of Renee's example. In fact, as you listen to Renee talking in the next few paragraphs, focus not on what she's saying but rather on how she's talking and why she's talking the way she is. The point of the computer program, which Schoenfeld created, was to teach students about how to calculate the slope of a line. Slope, as I'm sure you remember, is rise over run. The slope of the line in our example is 1, since the rise is 5 and the run is 5. So there is Renee. She's sitting at the keyboard, and she's trying to figure out what numbers to enter in order to get the computer to draw a line that is absolutely vertical, that is directly superimposed over the y-axis. Now, those of you who remember your high school math will know that this is, in fact, impossible. A vertical line has an undefined slope. Its rise is infinite, any number on the y-axis starting at 0 and going on forever. Its run on the x-axis, meanwhile, is 0. Infinity divided by 0 is not a number. But Renee doesn't realize that what she's trying to do can't be done. She is, rather, in the grip of what Schoenfeld calls a glorious misconception, and the reason Schoenfeld likes to show this particular tape is that it is a perfect demonstration of how this misconception came to be resolved. Renee was a nurse. She wasn't someone who had been particularly interested in mathematics in the past. But she had somehow gotten hold of the software and was hooked. Now, what I want to do is make a straight line with this formula, parallel to the y-axis, she begins. Schoenfeld is sitting next to her. She looks over at him anxiously. It's been 5 years since I did any of this. She starts to fiddle with the program, typing in different numbers. Now if I change the slope that way. -1. Now what I mean to do is make the line go straight. As she types in numbers, the line on the screen changes. Oops. That's not going to do it. She looks puzzled. What are you trying to do? Schoenfeld asks. What I'm trying to do is make a straight line parallel to the y-axis. What do I need to do here? I think what I need to do is change this a little bit. She points at the place where the number for the y-axis is. That was something I discovered. That when you go from 1 to 2, there was a rather big change. But now if you get way up there you have to keep changing. This is Renee's glorious misconception. She's noticed the higher she makes the y-axis coordinate, the steeper the line gets. So she thinks the key to making a vertical line is just making the y-axis coordinate large enough. I guess 12 or even 13 could do it. Maybe even as much as 15. She frowns. She and Schoenfeld go back and forth. She asks him questions. He prods her gently in the right direction. She keeps trying and trying, one approach after another. At one point, she types in 20. The line gets a little bit steeper. She types in 40. The line gets steeper still. I see that there is a relationship there. But as to why, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. What if I do 80? If 40 gets me halfway, then 80 should get me all the way to the y-axis. So let's just see what happens. She types in 80. The line is steeper. But it's still not totally vertical. Oh. It's infinity, isn't it? It's never going to get there. Renee is close. But then she reverts to her original misconception. So what do I need? 100? Every time you double the number, you get halfway to the y-axis. But it never gets there. She types in 100. It's closer. But not quite there yet. She starts to think out loud. It's obvious she's on the verge of figuring something out. Well, I knew this, though. But I knew that. For each one up, it goes that many over. I'm still somewhat confused as to why. She pauses, squinting at the screen. I'm getting confused. It's 1/10 of the way to the 1. But I don't want it to be. And then she sees it. Oh. It's any number up, and 0 over. It's any number divided by 0. Her face lights up. A vertical line is anything divided by 0, and that's an undefined number. Oh. Okay. Now I see. The slope of a vertical line is undefined. Oh. That means something now. I won't forget that. 6. Over the course of his career, Schoenfeld has videotaped countless students as they worked on math problems. But the René tape is one of his favorites because of how beautifully it illustrates what he considers to be the secret to learning mathematics. 22 minutes pass from the moment René begins playing with the computer program to the moment she says, "Oh. That means something now." That's a long time. This is 8th grade mathematics, Schoenfeld said. If I put the average 8th grader in the same position as René, I'm guessing that after the first few attempts, they would have said, "I don't get it. I need you to explain it." Schoenfeld once asked a group of high school students how long they would work on a homework question before they concluded it was too hard for them ever to solve. Their answers ranged from 30 seconds to 5 minutes, with the average answer 2 minutes. But René persists. She experiments. She goes back over the same issues time and again. She thinks out loud. She keeps going and going. She simply won't give up. She knows on some vague level that there is something wrong with her theory about how to draw a vertical line, and she won't stop until she's absolutely sure she has it right. René wasn't a math natural. Abstract concepts like slope and undefined clearly didn't come easily to her. But Schoenfeld could not have found her more impressive. There's a will to make sense that drives what she does, Schoenfeld says. She wouldn't accept a superficial, "Yeah, you're right," and walk away. That's not who she is. And that's really unusual. He rewound the tape and pointed to a moment when René reacted with genuine surprise to something on the screen. "Look," he said. "She does a double take." Many students would just let that fly by. Instead, she thought, "That doesn't jibe with whatever I'm thinking. I don't get it. That's important. I want an explanation." And when she finally gets the explanation, she says, "Yeah, that fits." At Berkeley, Schoenfeld teaches a course on problem solving, the entire point of which, he says, is to get his students to unlearn the mathematical habits they picked up on the way to university. "I pick a problem that I don't know how to solve," he says. "I tell my students, you're going to have a 2-week take-home exam. I know your habits. You're going to do nothing for the first week and start it next week, and I want to warn you now, if you only spend 1 week on this, you're not going to solve it. If, on the other hand, you start working the day I give you the midterm, you'll be frustrated. You'll come to me and say, 'It's impossible.' I'll tell you, 'Keep working,' and by week 2, you'll find you'll make significant progress." We sometimes think of being good at mathematics as an innate ability. You either have it, or you don't. But to Schoenfeld, it's not so much ability as attitude. You master mathematics if you are willing to try. That's what Schoenfeld attempts to teach his students. Success is a function of persistence and doggedness and the willingness to work hard for 22 minutes to make sense of something that most people would give up on after 30 seconds. Put a bunch of Renés in a classroom, and give them the space and time to explore mathematics for themselves, and you could go a long way. Or imagine a country where René's doggedness is not the exception, but a cultural trait, embedded as deeply as the culture of honor in the Cumberland Plateau. Now that would be a country good at math. 7. Every 4 years, an international group of educators administers a comprehensive mathematics and science test to elementary and junior high students around the world. It's the TMSS, and the point of the TMSS is to compare the educational achievement of one country with another's. When students sit down to take the TMSS exam, they also have to fill out a questionnaire. It asks them all kinds of things, such as what their parents' level of education is, and what their views about math are, and what their friends are like. It's not a trivial exercise. It's about 120 questions long. In fact, it is so tedious and demanding that many students leave as many as 10 or 20 questions blank. Now, here's the interesting part. As it turns out, the average number of items answered on that questionnaire varies from country to country. It is possible, in fact, to rank all the participating countries according to how many items their students answer on the questionnaire. Now, what do you think happens if you compare the questionnaire rankings with the math rankings on the TMSS? They are exactly the same. In other words, countries whose students are willing to concentrate and sit still long enough and focus on answering every single question in an endless questionnaire are the same countries whose students do the best job of solving math problems. The person who discovered this fact is an educational researcher at the University of Pennsylvania named Erling Boe, and he stumbled across it by accident. It came out of the blue, he says. Boe hasn't even been able to publish his findings in a scientific journal, because, he says, it's just a bit too weird. Remember, he's not saying that the ability to finish the questionnaire and the ability to excel on the math test are related. He's saying that they are the same. If you compare the two rankings, they are identical. Think about this another way. Imagine that every year, there was a math Olympics in some fabulous city in the world. And every country in the world sent its own team of 1,000 eighth graders. Bo's point is that we could predict precisely the order in which every country would finish in the math Olympics without asking a single math question. All we would have to do is give them some task measuring how hard they were willing to work. In fact, we wouldn't even have to give them a task. We should be able to predict which countries are best at math simply by looking at which national cultures place the highest emphasis on effort and hard work. So, which places are at the top of both lists? The answer shouldn't surprise you: Singapore, South Korea, China, Hong Kong, and Japan. What those five have in common, of course, is that they are all cultures shaped by the tradition of wet rice agriculture and meaningful work. They are the kinds of places where, for hundreds of years, penniless peasants, slaving away in the rice paddies 3,000 hours a year, said things to one another like, "No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich." Chapter 9. Merita's Bargain. All my friends now are from KIPP. 1. In the mid-1990s, an experimental public school called the KIPP Academy opened on the 4th floor of Lou Gehrig Jr. High School in New York City. Lou Gehrig is in the 7th School District, otherwise known as the South Bronx, one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City. It is a squat, gray 1960s-era building across the street from a bleak-looking group of high-rises. A few blocks over is Grand Concourse, the borough's main thoroughfare. These are not streets that you'd happily walk down, alone, after dark. KIPP is a middle school. Classes are large. The 5th grade has 2 sections of 35 students each. There are no entrance exams or admissions requirements. Students are chosen by lottery, with any 4th grader living in the Bronx eligible to apply. Roughly half of the students are African American, the rest are Hispanic. 3/4 of the children come from single-parent homes. 90% qualify for free or reduced lunch, which is to say that their families earn so little that the federal government chips in so the children can eat properly at lunchtime. KIPP Academy seems like the kind of school in the kind of neighborhood with the kind of student that would make educators despair, except that the minute you enter the building, it's clear that something is different. The students walk quietly down the hallways in single file. In the classroom, they are taught to turn and address anyone talking to them in a protocol known as slant, smile, sit up, listen, ask questions, nod when being spoken to, and track with your eyes. On the walls of the school's corridors are hundreds of pennants from the colleges that KIPP graduates have gone on to attend. Last year, hundreds of families from across the Bronx entered the lottery for KIPP's 2 5th-grade classes. It is no exaggeration to say that just over 10 years into its existence, KIPP has become one of the most desirable public schools in New York City. What KIPP is most famous for is mathematics. In the South Bronx, only about 16% of all middle school students are performing at or above their grade level in math. But at KIPP, by the end of 5th grade, many of the students call math their favorite subject. In 7th grade, KIPP students start high school algebra. By the end of 8th grade, 84% of the students are performing at or above their grade level, which is to say that this motley group of randomly chosen lower-income kids from dingy apartments in one of the country's worst neighborhoods, whose parents, in an overwhelming number of cases, never set foot in a college, do as well in mathematics as the privileged 8th graders of America's wealthy suburbs. "Our kids' reading is on point," said David Levin, who founded KIPP with a fellow teacher, Michael Feinberg, in 1994. They struggle a little bit with writing skills. But when they leave here, they rock in math. There are now more than 50 KIPP schools across the United States, with more on the way. The KIPP program represents one of the most promising new educational philosophies in the United States. But its success is best understood not in terms of its curriculum, its teachers, its resources, or some kind of institutional innovation. KIPP is, rather, an organization that has succeeded by taking the idea of cultural legacies seriously. 2. In the early 19th century, a group of reformers set out to establish a system of public education in the United States. What passed for public school at the time was a haphazard assortment of locally run one-room schoolhouses and overcrowded urban classrooms scattered around the country. In rural areas, schools closed in the spring and fall and ran all summer long, so that children could help out in the busy planting and harvesting seasons. In the city, many schools mirrored the long and chaotic schedules of the children's working-class parents. The reformers wanted to make sure that all children went to school and that public school was comprehensive, meaning that all children got enough schooling to learn how to read and write and do basic arithmetic and function as productive citizens. But as the historian Kenneth Gold has pointed out, the early educational reformers were also tremendously concerned that children not get too much schooling. In 1871, for example, the U.S. Commissioner of Education published a report by Edward Jarvis on the relation of education to insanity. Jarvis had studied 1,741 cases of insanity and concluded that overstudy was responsible for 205 of them. Education lays the foundation of a large portion of the causes of mental disorder, Jarvis wrote. Similarly, the pioneer of public education in Massachusetts, Horace Mann, believed that working students too hard would create a most pernicious influence upon character and habits. Not infrequently is health itself destroyed by overstimulating the mind. In the education journals of the day, there were constant worries about overtaxing students or blunting their natural abilities through too much schoolwork, the reformers, Gold writes. Strove for ways to reduce time spent studying, because long periods of respite could save the mind from injury. Hence the elimination of Saturday classes, the shortening of the school day, and the lengthening of vacation, all of which occurred over the course of the 19th century. Teachers were cautioned that, when are required to study, their bodies should not be exhausted by long confinement, nor their minds bewildered by prolonged application. Rest also presented particular opportunities for strengthening cognitive and analytical skills. As one contributor to the Massachusetts Teacher suggested, it is when thus relieved from the state of tension belonging to actual study that boys and girls, as well as men and women, acquire the habit of thought and reflection, and of forming their own conclusions, independently of what they are taught and the authority of others. This idea, that effort must be balanced by rest, could not be more different from Asian notions about study and work, of course. But then again, the Asian worldview was shaped by the rice paddy. In the Pearl River Delta, the rice farmer planted 2 and sometimes 3 crops a year. The land was fallow only briefly. In fact, one of the singular features of rice cultivation is that because of the nutrients carried by the water used in irrigation, the more a plot of land is cultivated, the more fertile it gets. But in Western agriculture, the opposite is true. Unless a wheat or cornfield is left fallow every few years, the soil becomes exhausted. Every winter, fields are empty. The hard labor of spring planting and fall harvesting is followed, like clockwork, by the slower pace of summer and winter. This is the logic of reformers applied to the cultivation of young minds. We formulate new ideas by analogy, working from what we know toward what we don't know, and what the reformers knew were the rhythms of the agricultural seasons. A mind must be cultivated, but not too much, lest it be exhausted. And what was the remedy for the dangers of exhaustion? The long summer vacation, a peculiar and distinctive American legacy that has had profound consequences for the learning patterns of the students of the present day. 3. Summer vacation is a topic seldom mentioned in American educational debates. It is considered a permanent and inviolate feature of school life, like high school football or the senior prom. But take a look at the following sets of elementary school test score results, and see if your faith in the value of long summer holidays isn't profoundly shaken. These numbers come from research led by the Johns Hopkins University sociologist Carl Alexander. Alexander tracked the progress of 650 first graders from the Baltimore public school system, looking at how they scored on a widely used math and reading skills exam called the California Achievement Test. These are reading scores for the first 5 years of elementary school, broken down by socioeconomic class, low, middle, and high class. First grade 2